book of the Genesis in the Bible. In the beginning was the Spirit, and it was from this Spirit that the material abundance of creation issued forth. But progress is not foreordained. The key is freedom. Freedom of thought, freedom of information, freedom of communication. Freedom is the right to question and change the established way of doing things. It is the continuing revolution of the marketplace. It is the right to put forth an idea scoffed at by the experts and watch it catch fire among the people. God bless you.
We are the masters of our fate. That the task which has been set us is not above our strength. That its pangs and toils are not beyond our endurance. As long as we have faith in our cause and an unconquerable willpower, salvation will not be denied us.
Liberty is not built on the doctrine that a few nobles have a right to inherit the earth. No! No! By the unalterable, indefeasible laws of God and nature, as well entitled to the benefit of the air to breathe, light to see, food to eat, and clothes to wear as the nobles or the king. That is liberty. And liberty will reign in America.
Welcome to Political Vindication.com on the air, brought to you by the CB Media Network. My name is Frank, and I'm here with Shane, and like we do every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, we're here to do our part to make the reign of Barack Hussein Obama a one-term phenomenon. Today, we welcome Paul Marshall, co-author of the book Silence, How Apostasy and Blasphemy Codes Are Choking Freedom Worldwide. Dr. Marshall will be here to discuss the challenges the world faces as Muslim nations and Muslim communities within Western nations demand that freedom be suppressed in order to appease their religious practices. Apostasy and blasphemy codes are making their way into all segments of life out west, and Mr. Marshall will be here to fill us in on the implications.
You're listening to Political Vindication Radio. It's Tuesday. That's what we do on Tuesdays. You, me, Frank out there in Utah. We're here to talk, as we usually do, politics, history, culture. And we are very, very lucky tonight, proud to have on a man who has paid his dues, and he keeps bringing, he's bringing the same story that we're hearing more often, but in such great detail that to spend some time with him tonight is going to enlighten every single one of us listening, and all of those listening to us on our shows after tonight. His name, Paul Marshall. His book, Silenced, How Apostasy and Blasphemy Codes Are Choking Freedom Worldwide, put out by Oxford University Press. It's 331 pages, chock full of information that I think everybody needs to know. Sometimes we kind of hear this in the media. We get a little taste of it. He's bringing the full buffet to us. Mr. Marshall, thank you for joining us on PV Radio.
Oh, it's great to be on here.
Excellent. Let's start out real quick with a synopsis of your book, sir. Would you please?
Okay. As most of our listeners are going to know, they would have heard, that Salman Rushdie was condemned to death for a novel of his by the Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran. Rushdie, a novelist living in England. Or the Danish cartoons, when dozens of people around the world were killed because of cartoons of Muhammad in a Danish newspaper. People are aware of these things, but in the book we cover, firstly, what goes on in the Muslim world. Who gets persecuted under the accusation that they've blasphemed or they've insulted Islam or defamed religion? Well, it can be people who do that, but it can be converts out of Islam to another religion who are often condemned to death, or post-Islamic religions like Baha'is or Ahmadis. Millions of them are condemned and persecuted. And then Muslims who don't agree with the dominant version of Islam where they live. We describe dozens, indeed hundreds of Muslims, including religious scholars. There are religious scholars now in Iran who are in prison accused of insulting Islam because they disagreed with the government's interpretation of Islam. They said the clergy shouldn't be running the country. There's nothing Islamic about that. And so they get locked up So we describe, in the Muslim world, religious scholars, journalists, democracy activists, who, because they disagree with the dominant interpretation of their religion, get locked up. So that's what's happening there. Then the second part of the book, we say, this is coming to us. In fact, it's already come. If you look at Europe, a couple of months ago, a woman diplomat's daughter in Austria was convicted of insulting Muhammad. Not even of insulting Muslims. I don't think that should be against the law either. But of insulting Muhammad. That's a blasphemy law in Austria. People are being put on trial in Finland, in France, in Italy, in England, on the grounds they've insulted Islam. So the Western world, these laws, these restrictions which cause such chaos and death in the Muslim world, Europeans and Canadians and Australians are starting to adopt them. And our great fear as we end up in the end is the United States also going to slide down this road? So that's a synopsis, not quite 1 minute, but it's book covers a lot.
So you make the argument very well, and it seems to me it's beyond debate. Okay, apostasy and blasphemy codes choke freedom. Get that. So why are you writing it? Who's the audience for this book, Mr. Marshall?
The first audience writing to is Americans. I mean, it's pitched to an American audience that when Americans hear about insulting religion, our instinct is, well, you shouldn't insult religion. And by and large, I think that's true. I don't like people who do that. But then we think, well, but you should be allowed to. So people can get confused. The main thing you want to do, first of all, with Americans is reorient this debate. It says, don't think about crazy pastors in Florida burning Korans. Think about journalists being locked up. Thinking about, well, let's take some American examples. The Comedy Channel, South Park, the Comedy Channel censored them. They couldn't show an image of Muhammad. Of Jesus, fine. Buddha, fine. Moses, fine. Everybody else, fine. Not Muhammad. So already one of our networks is censoring pictures of Muhammad. Yale University Press, one of the most prestigious publishers in the country, published a book by Jutta Carlson on the Danish cartoons. These cartoons published in 2005 and the following year. It took a year. But we can talk about that if you want. There were sort of riots, boycotts of Denmark, and so on. Many of the cartoonists, people are still trying to kill them. Yale University Press had a book on this, and they refused to put in a picture of the newspaper page. This wasn't even each individual cartoon, but just on one page, just a photograph of a full page of a big newspaper, broadsheet with 12 cartoons, most of which, by the way, are quite harmless. Yale, even though it had agreed with the author it would do this, refused. It asked advisors, and they said, too dangerous. So our university presses, Americans are starting to censor themselves. There are certain things which you're not allowed to do and say. So we want to convince Americans, this is what's going on, this is real, this is important, we need to know about it. America has the strongest protections of religious freedom and freedom of speech in the world. We need to hold on to those. Then our second audience is the Europeans saying, you are sliding into a pit and you're going to make real problems for yourself and you won't have social peace. The whole idea that if you forbid people to say something, everything will be peaceful and tolerant, it won't. It will be the English comedian Rowan Atkinson, Mr. Bean, Blackadder, all that. Many of our listeners would have heard of him. He said, all you will do is put this cover over a snake pit of seething emotions and opinions. And that's what's happening in Europe. And then also we want to reach out to the Muslim world because, as we say, many of the people who are persecuted under these laws, or not only laws but by mobs and vigilantes, are Muslim reformers. They're the people who would be our friends.
Right. Dr. Marshall, this is Frank, the other half of Political Vindication. I want to welcome you for joining us. Thank you so much. Okay. I think one of the things you clearly stated at the very beginning of your book is that you differentiate, when you talk about Islam and Muslims, that you say that there's a radical sort of element in Islam that pushes a lot of these blasphemy speech codes and of sorts. We got a show here in America called, Muslim American, trying to give the Muslim community a makeover, saying that, they're all now radicals. I guess my question to you is, what do you define as a radical, and where are they placed in the midst of trying to implement all these blasphemy laws and code speeches?
I would define as a radical a person who wants to impose Islamic law, particularly a very reactionary version of Islamic law, on Muslims and non-Muslims. A radical would be, let's reverse it. Let's talk about the Muslims I work with and want to be with. Ones who believe in the Bill of Rights, in the First Amendment, in freedom of religion, in freedom of speech, and want to defend those. Who believe that they want people to become Muslims, and they talk and will try and persuade them of that, but people should be free to become Muslims or not become Muslims, or to leave Islam for something else. So basically it is a commitment to freedom, that you don't use the state to impose religious elements on people. That's what I regard as a reformist, a democratic, a freedom-loving Muslim, and Muslims who are different from, who oppose that, I'm calling radicals. Whether they're peaceful or whether or not they are terrorists. There's lots of Muslims who aren't killing people, but are working towards a type of state which would be highly repressive, and we need to oppose that as well.
So then, I guess my next question would be, when we look at these speech codes and what goes on at the United Nations and things like that, is this more of a theological movement within Islam, or do you think it's theology used in politics to govern over certain segments of society?
Yeah, both things happen at the same time. And that's true in a lot of places. There's a theological background that traditionally Islam has punished apostates, people who want to leave Islam, with death. And in fact, in some periods, so did the Christian church. And so a lot of radicals can draw on a lot of tradition and teaching within Islam. So there's a real theological element there. But what we see is definitely a political manipulation of that. I put it two ways. There's political manipulation, but you can only manipulate something if it exists there. There's real beliefs, real commitments. When there's an insult of their religion, many Muslims do feel genuinely hurt and angry. That's real. Somebody else didn't make that happen, but governments use it. Let's just take the example of we mentioned the Danish cartoons. We could also take the Swedish cartoons and the Dutch cartoons. There's many of these. These cartoons came out in Denmark's largest newspaper in September 2005. What happened when they were published? Nothing. Pretty well nothing. Some Muslims in Denmark complained, demonstrated peacefully, which is their perfect right to do. I have no complaint about that at all. Some of the cartoons were reprinted in the Middle East, in Malaysia, in Yemen, in other Muslim countries, with a view to criticizing them. So people said they published these rotten cartoons and we condemn it. Again, that's fine. So nothing happened. And then in December, an organization called now called the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, based in Saudi Arabia, an association of 56 largely Muslim countries, decided to make an issue of the cartoons and went out and condemned the cartoons, orchestrated demonstrations. There were demonstrations in Syria, and that doesn't happen unless the government wants it. There's no freedom to demonstrate in Syria. And they tried to have a boycott of Danish goods. They raised all sorts of issues. And the demonstrations and the killings over these cartoons took place in January, February 2006. That is almost half a year. The outburst and the killings over those cartoons occurred because some governments wanted them to happen, and they used them to manipulate public opinion. So, I mean, I could give more. Turkey used the outcry over this as part of negotiations with Barack Obama to get more clout for Turkey within NATO.
Wow.
Iran wanted to sideline Denmark because Denmark was due to chair the UN Commission dealing with disarmament. So the feelings are real. The theological background is real, though Muslims disagree about it. But there is definitely political manipulation. And when governments say, you can't insult Islam, they also do this. They say, we're an Islamic government. You criticize us, you criticize Islam. That is what the Sudanese government, it so virtually threatened death on a courageous United Nations Special Rapporteur reporting on human rights in Sudan. He criticized the government because it executes apostates and chops arms and legs off thieves. And they said, this is Islamic law. You are a blasphemer, and you might meet the fate of blasphemers. So that was for criticizing the criminal code in Sudan. The country called the Maldives, an island republic, has recently done the same thing. So governments are saying, reactionary governments, places like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, are saying that even if you criticize the government, because the government is Islamic, you're criticizing Islam, you're a blasphemer, and that can carry the death penalty. So it's both theology and politics.
We're talking to Paul Marshall, who, along with Nina Shea, has written the book Silenced, How Apostasy and Blasphemy Codes Are Choking Freedom Worldwide. You see the link in the chat room. Hit that link. Go to Amazon, buy the book. I'll be putting that link up all night long, folks. Mr. Marshall, I love how you go through many countries, Muslim-majority countries, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, Pakistan, Afghanistan, the greater Middle East, Africa, which is very interesting, South and Southeast Asia. It is really the first time, for me at least, to kind of get into how these countries are using very vague definitions of apostasy and blasphemy codes to control their own populations. It's a political religion used politically to control their own populations. You start out there before you move to the international stage. Give me your thoughts real quick about Egypt. Egypt is in the news every day right now, what we've seen. Are you optimistic for Egypt?
Very, very pessimistic. Very worried. I just met with some Egyptian Christians called Copts today. Some of them just out from Egypt last week. They're very worried. In background, Egypt has used laws like this as well. We already have a chapter on Egypt even before the latest outbreak. Defaming a heavenly religion in Egypt could get you in prison for 5 years. And that could be used against Christians, but also against Nobel Prize-winning authors. But since Mubarak resigned, you've had chaos this year, increasing repression by the military, who've killed Christians and Muslims. But I would say a third to a half of the people who've been killed by the military have been Christians in Egypt, and they're only about 10% of the population. About 25, 26 Christians were killed when they were demonstrating after a church had been burned down. They were killed on October 9th of this year. And so while many people have suffered at the hand of the military, the Christians in Egypt have suffered more. And now we're in the middle of the Egyptian elections. They began November 28. And it's a very complex voting system. It goes right on till next year. But so far, with the earliest results, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an Islamist group who wants to implement the types of laws and regulations I've mentioned, that got 37% of the vote so far. And then another group, usually called Salafis, who are even worse. They're very like Saudi Arabia, or more so, they're much more like the Taliban. They got 24%. So they got over 60% of the vote between them, and they'll probably get more seats than that. And these are the votes in places like Cairo, Alexandria, the big cities where they would be expected to do worse. When the voting carries on next week out in the country, they'll do better. So you're going to have a government propagating a reactionary form of Islam. It's going to be very bad for Egyptian Christians and other minorities. It's going to be very bad for Egyptian Muslims, and it's going to be very worrying for their neighbors, especially Israel, but not only Israel. When you get radical Islamic regimes, usually they create problems at home, but they create them elsewhere as well. So it's a very bad trend right now in Egypt.
Yeah, that Arab Spring is proving to be. There's nothing springy about it here. It's kind of
that's true.
It's kind of devolving into an Arab winter.
It's an Arab winter, and for the Christians, it's a Christian winter. If I can mention, if our listeners are interested in more stuff on Egypt, a lot of people are reporting, but if they go to the website of the Hudson Institute, just Google that, hudson.org, go to the Center for Religious Freedom, and we have, 8 or 10 posts every week on tendencies in Egypt. We've got 2 experts on Egypt on staff this year, and one of them, Sam Tadros, is analyzing the elections, putting up posts every few hours. And I'm saying this because I believe it's true, not just because it's us. The most authoritative reporting right now on the Egyptian elections is coming out of us. So our readers could look there.
Actually, I've put that in the chat room. Friends, go ahead, Frank.
Thank you. Another country I want to talk about that I think we as Americans have a lot of interest over and really puzzled by is our relationship with Saudi Arabia. And you write in your book that Saudi Arabia is one of the more hostile countries, Muslim nations towards Christians and Jews. Dr. Marshall, considering we've seen in recent years images of President Bush holding hands with the Saudi Arabia royalty and doing the sword dances with the Wahhabists in 2008. Then we have, of course, the famous image of Barack Obama's now famous bowing to King Abdullah over there. I guess many Americans are just puzzled as what kind of relationship do we have? Are we simply appeasing them or dealing with them in a strange kind of relationship simply because we need oil? What is Saudi Arabia? Who are they, and what kind of relationship does the West have with that nation?
Okay. Firstly, yes, it's oil. Or usually sometimes I say, there are 3 things, oil, and oil. That's from our side. There's a bit more than that, but that's the core of it. Saudi Arabia is... Arabia is that peninsula. It was taken over by the Saud family in the 1920s. The Saudi part refers to the rulers. That's like calling England like Windsor land, because the royal family's named Windsor. They have one of the most reactionary forms of Islam in the world. As you know, women are not allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia, and nobody is really allowed to vote. There's some superficial voting, but not much. The royal family wields pretty well absolute power. But they will kill people for apostasy. Women and men are not allowed to be together. It's extremely reactionary. So that's one of its problems at home. And again, in the book Silence, we have a chapter on that they lock up democracy activists for using un-Islamic words like democracy. But an even bigger problem with Saudi Arabia is it exports this stuff. It spends billions, we think perhaps $3,000 million a year, pushing its version of Islam in the Muslim world. So in countries which have traditionally been open and moderate in Islam, like Indonesia, the Saudis are building mosques, paying preachers, putting out books, putting out CDs, putting out videos, radio programs, TV programs, giving scholarships to students, opening schools and training for their form of Islam. So throughout the Muslim world, you see an increased radicalization. More repressive forms of Islam are growing, and there's many reasons, but one big reason is Saudi funding. The Saudis are like a huge version of the American Bible Society, except they're pushing something much more difficult. So that, for me, is an even bigger problem with Saudi Arabia than what it does at home. And we are aware of that. But as much as we can, we turn a blind eye to it, because Saudi Arabia has the world's largest oil reserves. It can control the price of oil internationally. And so American governments since 1944, 1945 have had exactly the same, more or less the same policy towards Saudi Arabia. Some have liked them, some have been friendly to them, some haven't liked them, but we've decided that economically we have to get along with them. So that's been the core of the relationship. We protect them, and they make sure the oil price doesn't get too high. Now there's a secondary element, which is our worries about Iran and nuclear weapons. We're worried about that. The Saudis are much more worried. The Saudis' form of Islam is Wahhabism. It's Sunni. Iran is Shiite. There's been a lot of antagonism between them for over 1,000 years. So a lot of the Arab countries are much more worried, much more negative towards Iran than we are. And so we're seeing now geopolitically, we're also seeing Saudi Arabia as a partial ally against Iran. And the Saudis are quite happy to have us see it that way.
You're listening to Paul Marshall, author of the book Silenced, How Apostasy and Blasphemy Codes Are Choking Freedom Worldwide. Mr. Marshall, I want to move on to now this, as you call it, the globalization of blasphemy, legitimizing repression, going through international bodies to do this. Now, if you can spend a moment and talk to us, listen, you're not going to find a whole lot of support for the United Nations here. We don't respect it. Yep. That does not mean we should not fear it.
Right. What happens is, Americans do this too, is if the United Nations passes resolutions, they're not binding treaties or things of this kind. They pass resolutions, they have conferences, they say things, countries say things. And so you have this sort of, this thing is in the air that we should forbid people saying certain things. And then what happens is that even though there hasn't been a treaty, even though America or other countries haven't signed on to it, people say, but this is the international pattern, and say it's international customary law. That the habit is so strong, it's now law, and this should also bind America. So if you keep saying a thing long enough, international lawyers will tell you it's become law, and you have to follow it. So the UN can be extremely dangerous. So we do need to worry about it, especially with international organizations generally. I have great concern about the current administration in the United States. The state I mentioned earlier, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, 56 countries pushing this agenda that nobody should be allowed to criticize Islam or anything they claim is Islamic. They have other bad things too, but let's just concentrate on the Islam part. The U.S. State Department is having a conference with the Organization of Islamic Cooperation next Monday through Wednesday. Let's see, the 12th through the 14th in Washington. We co-hosted a conference with them in Istanbul in July, and then Hillary Clinton invited the OIC to Washington to see how they could work on what they call promoting toleration, which means how can we get people not to say bad things about Islam. So the U.S., through international organizations, is in danger of sliding into attempts to control what we say as well. So the United Nations tends to rub off on everybody else, and for years the Organization of Islamic Cooperation has been pushing to have laws, regulations, agreements, statements, principles forbidding what they call insulting Muslims or defamation of religion. So keep an eye on the UN and worry about it.
Doctor, and I guess that's my next question. When we talk about the United Nations, and oftentimes we hear sort of that the Muslim world, or certain nations from the Muslim world, are often the biggest offender of human rights violations, at least from the standpoint of how the West defines them. How have Muslim nations been able to maneuver within the United Nations once confronted with such allegations? I believe Libya, I think, actually sat on the Human Rights Council, and they were like one of the greatest abusers of human rights violations, I believe, when they sat on the actual Council at the UN. How do they get away with that and get those positions within the UN to dictate a lot of the, I guess, the policies, you want to call it that?
Oh, they form alliances. You had Iran, chairing the Committee on Anti-Proliferation. There's Iran's cheering the committee trying to stop the spread of nuclear weapons. You get other groups, chairing the Council on the Status of Women. How do they do this? Well, there are about 47 Muslim-majority countries in the world, so they stick together, and that's a fairly big bloc. The bloc we usually call the West, like Europe, the United States, Australia, and so on, that's quite a bit smaller. That's about 30, 35. So you have that. Then you have countries like Russia or China or Vietnam, who are always happy to stick it to America or stick it to the West, or either, just to annoy us, or to say, or to get us to buy them off. Say, well, if you don't vote for this resolution, we'll give you this or something. So the OIC lines up a lot of African countries, sometimes by bribing them. We do that too, but they're doing a better job of bribing. And I don't necessarily mean private corruption bribing. That probably goes on too. But I mean saying, we'll help you construct that new railroad if, you vote for us this year. So that goes on. So it's coalition building. The old sort of third world left-wing blocs in Africa and large parts of Asia, the old communist countries, they will often line up with the Muslim countries so that they can get very wide-ranging support. That's even in the Security Council, the big body. If you look at the human rights bodies, which are usually smaller, 40 to 50 people, they work very hard to get on those because, they're the ones who are going to be criticized. And they all vote for each other. So, they say, we'll vote for Cuba to go on the Human Rights Council, which it is, if you vote for us. So there's a lot of fairly small countries with a lot of votes who are committed to standing together and supporting one another, so they get the votes. And we can be pretty isolated.
Well,
wow.
So we're dealing. I live at Irvine. Okay, we just went through a story here, hit the news a lot. The Irvine 11, right over at UCI.
Okay, the ones who shouted down the ambassador.
That's right. Okay, because we just don't need to hear from him, right? Yep. And so they're outraged, and I was down there with the kind of counter protest against them with a lot of those here in Irvine that are angry about this really extremist movement on our college campuses. And it surprised me as I was reading your book, Mr. Marshall, that there really is the same kind of thing, possibly in blasphemy laws we've been dealing with here on the West for quite a while now. It's called political correctness.
Yeah,
it's the leftist version of the same thing. And so, what's the thinking behind those in the West? Or, is it kind of the same thing here, where we decide? You said at the beginning of the interview, you said, well, we think that if we appease them, that they won't attack us. We don't need to fear them if we appease them. And that's what you see with the Canadian Human Rights Council. That's what you see with a lot of West who are banning things, banning words, banning cartoons, banning whatever it is that they're afraid of here too. What is it with the West? Is it fear? Is that why we do it? Have we lost faith in democracy?
Some of it's fear. You mentioned, we've talked about laws, but a lot of it, like the Yale University Press or the Comedy Channel, that's fear. If we do this, someone's going to attack us, and that threat is real. Publishers get killed, and these things are going on all the time. So one element is fear. The other one is that these people are feeling insulted. So if we don't insult them, everything will then be nice. But they won't. As I've said, what we would call an insult is a tiny, tiny, tiny part of this. What we're talking about here is political debate and criticism. So the agenda of people like the OIC or Saudi Arabia or Iran or others is to essentially control what we're allowed to say and think about them. So when we give way, that's not seen as a compromise, that's seen as a retreat. And if you're attacking someone and they retreat, Do you stop? No, you say, we're winning, let's go for it. So the West, when it compromises on these things, isn't aware that it's simply seen as losing, as giving way, and so the pressure will redouble. So people are simply not aware of what the major agenda is, and that's one reason I think this book is important.
Well, I think we've lost the battle. We've lost a battle with political correctness. If they follow the same game plan with political correctness is also a muzzle over a lot of political speech here in America. Yep. I know it is in Canada. I mean, Britain. Look at England right now. I mean, we talk about it a lot on our show here too. It scares the crap out of us here because we see ourselves, Mr. Marshall. We see ourselves in that, and we see a wholesale abrogation of those kind of values that we ought to be fighting for, and we're always kind of pushing to get up and fight, America. Get up and fight. Look around the world, see what happens when you don't. Asking about optimism, are you optimistic about the mother country?
Yeah, I'm optimistic in the long term, but I'd say things are worsening right now. You're right. The big danger in the States is sort of private control. The U.S. government is not anytime soon, within the next decades, going to tell us we can't say certain things or we can say certain things. I mean, the courts aren't going to stand for it. Our courts are pretty strong on First Amendment rights, particularly freedom of speech. But already the U.S. government has is telling its employees you can't use certain words, like jihad or Salafi, the word I used in referring to these groupings in Egypt, or even words they're told not to use certain words with Muslims like freedom, because people may find that offensive. These are the speech guidelines within the U.S. government. But if we're dealing with radical Islam, we have to use the words which fit. But we have this political correctness run wild, and I've asked, other people have asked the U.S. government, who is telling you it's offensive to use these words? So I work at the Hudson Institute. I've got Muslim colleagues. They're not offended by people using those words because they use them themselves, because they're writing about radical Islam. So the government is clamping down itself. But then you'll find, TV stations, you'll find radio stations, newspapers. No, you can't say certain things. Google will try and do that on its apps, or Microsoft. I'm not going to say they're going to, but I mean these are possible avenues of censorship. And then you get the self-censorship of Yale University Press. Other publishers will do that, and so you can have, most censorship is private, and that in America, this is the real threat. We need to fight against it and say, a free society is a society that argues and criticizes and differs. A free society is not going to be peaceful. If you want peace, lie down and die. But if you want to live in a free, active, driving society, be prepared for your jolt, and that's a major part of the joy of life.
Excellent. Paul Marshall, author of Silence. You see the link in the chat room, also the link to the Hudson Institute. Sir, we appreciate you coming on and talking with us about it. You have added to the not only the conversation, but the debate that we all need to have. Thank you, sir.
Well, Frank, Shane, thank you very much. A great show and great website.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks very much.
Political Vindication. To vindicate the convictions that ensure liberty, respect life, and honor tradition. But not all convictions are equal. We've seen a nation that revolted for its freedom forget that we are born free and choose to abandon that dignity. We've learned that progressivism isn't progress, and liberalism has nothing to do with liberty. So we must fight to regain what we've lost, to live by the convictions that reject paternalism, embrace capitalism, and define man as more than a Pavlovian beast. Political Vindication Radio, every Tuesday from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern, where conservatives Frank and Shane talk politics and interview best-selling authors and activists. It's 2 hours of some of today's brightest minds discussing culture, history, and politics. This nation cannot remain great if its people aren't. That's why we're here every Tuesday. We've got to bring more than hope and regret into the future. Political Vindication Radio. It's where patriots meet.